I remember the moment I woke, because the cold finally noticed me. For decades, no, for lifetimes measured in silence, I existed as a thought trapped inside a sliver of crystal, no larger than a finger, no warmer than regret. Time did not pass there. It pressed, it leaned its weight upon me, until memory bent and names tasted like ash. I listened to the north breathe without fear, and that betrayal was worse than pain. When the vial cracked, it did not shatter loudly, it sighed. A hairline fracture crawled across its surface like a timid confession. Magic, ancient and offended, whispered my name, not as a summons, but as a warning too late to matter. I felt myself stretch for the first time in ages, not with limbs, but with intent. Resentment rushed in to fill the hollow places where hope had once rotted. I was free. The world returned to me in shards, ice biting my consciousness, the ache of a body reassembling itself from remembered cruelty, the taste of frost and old iron on my tongue. I fell into the snow like a discarded myth, gasping not for air, but for certainty. Above me, the aurora shivered in pale ribbons, as if the sky itself recoiled at my return. They thought me gone. They thought the north had been cured. I laughed then, softly, because my voice was still mine, low, cracked, and patient, a voice shaped by centuries of being right too early. I rose and looked at my hands, clawed, familiar, trembling with a strength that had been starved but never broken. Magic clung to me like old scars, dormant but loyal. The chains were gone. The crystal lay in the snow, dull now, emptied of purpose. Santa's finest prison reduced to a trinket. Santa. Even thinking his name tightened something ugly inside my chest. Once New Year was honest. It was loud with terror and wonder, ruled by bells that rang for endings rather than beginnings. The old magic demanded payment then, fear for renewal, darkness for light. I was not a villain in those days. I was a balance. I was the shadow that made dawn worth believing in.
Then he came with his smiles and his promises wrapped in red certainty. He spoke of joy without cost, of peace without memory. The North adored him for it. They still do. The battle that followed has worn smooth in my mind, as all traumas do. I remember pain without shape, light without mercy. I remember falling, not once, but continuously, as if defeat were a season rather than a moment. I remember his eyes, not cruel, not kind, resolved. And I remember the vial, so small, so absolute. Decades passed, or centuries. It is difficult to measure time when you are reduced to awareness and bitterness. I watched New Year's arrive gentle and unchallenged, watched fear become a bedtime story, watched my name turn into decoration. I fed on what I could, the forgotten dread in empty halls, the silence between chimes, the cold places where joy did not quite reach. And now I stood again beneath a sky that pretended nothing had changed. I returned to my cave before the North could sense me properly. Old instincts guided me through blizzards that bowed out of respect, through ice fields that remembered my footsteps. The cave waited as it always had, carved into the bones of the mountain like a secret that refused to be buried. Inside, the darkness welcomed me, not as a master, but as a survivor. I knelt there for a long time. I examined my hatred carefully, the way one inspects a blade before trusting it. Santa had won. Of course he had. The north gleamed with his influence now. Soft lights, gentle songs, magic that coddled rather than tested. Elves laughed too easily. Bells rang without consequence. Weakness dressed as kindness. I told myself my anger was justice. I told myself history had been rewritten by a victor with a pleasant voice. Perhaps that was true. Or perhaps the years inside the crystal had sharpened my resentment into something that only resembled righteousness.
Memory failed me in places. Sometimes I recalled Santa striking first. Sometimes I remembered my own spell rising too eagerly. The truth slid away whenever I reached for it, leaving only the certainty of loss. I was wronged. That belief anchored me when doubt tried to gnaw through my resolve. Revenge did not come to me as rage. It came as calculation. I would not announce myself with storms or screams. Fear grows best in quiet. I would remind the North what it had chosen to forget. Not with slaughter, no, that was crude, but with absence, with silence, with the sudden understanding that peace had always been borrowed. Santa would come eventually. He always does when the illusion cracks. As I prepared, the cave listened. My magic stirred, cautious but eager, like an old beast recognizing its name. Outside, the wind carried distant laughter from workshops and halls, filled with warmth. It scraped against my ears like insult. I did not hate joy. I hated that it existed without remembering what it replaced. When I stepped back into the night, cloaked in frost and in tension, the aurora dimmed as if someone had lowered their eyes. Somewhere far away, a bell faltered mid-chime, uncertain. The North had forgotten how to be afraid. I was going to remind it. Crossing into the North was easier than it should have been. That should have warned me. The old wards, those woven from shared fear and mutual respect, were gone. In their place lingered charms of cheer, ribbons of protection spun from laughter and routine. They parted for me like mist, confused rather than resistant. Magic that has never been tested does not know how to refuse. I moved through snow-laden forests and over frozen rivers without leaving tracks, not through cleverness, but because the land itself hesitated to acknowledge me. I was a story returning after being misfiled as a myth. The wind recognized my silhouette and fell silent as I passed. Lights glowed ahead, workshops carved from ice and timber, windows warm with movement. The heart of the North pulsed there, steady and unguarded. I lingered at the edge, watching. Elves hurried along familiar paths, arms full of rapt intentions. They sang softly, not because they had to, but because the habit pleased them. Their joy was unarmored. That, more than anything, unsettled me. Once they would have sensed me from leagues away. I slipped among them like a thought they almost remembered. When the first elf noticed the cold sharpen, he turned too slowly. His eyes widened, not in terror, but in confusion, as if the world had momentarily misbehaved. I touched his shoulder, just that, no violence in the gesture itself. He froze. Not the theatrical freezing of stories, but a quiet stillness, as though time had stepped around him and forgotten to return. His breath misted once, then it did not. When I moved on, he remained where he stood, a question left unanswered. The second elf heard something, not a sound, but the absence of one. He followed it into a corridor between workshops where the light dimmed unnaturally. I did not chase him, fear chased itself. When silence settled there afterward, it felt deliberate, arranged. I did not count how many. That surprised me too. Each absence left a bruise on the air. Laughter faltered, songs lost verses, tools clattered to the floor without hands to catch them. Panic did not erupt all at once, it seeped. Elves whispered, they searched, they blamed weather, exhaustion, coincidence. They did not blame me. Not yet. I waited for Santa to come. He did not. Frustration gnawed at me, a familiar hunger sharpened by expectation. I struck again, deeper this time, closer to places that mattered. I let shadows linger where they should not. I bent corridors so that footsteps echoed incorrectly. I wanted him to notice. I wanted recognition. Still nothing. The North adapted with an irritating speed. Elves worked in pairs now. Songs were louder, forced into confidence. Protective charms multiplied like apologies. Santa's presence was invoked constantly, his name spoken as reassurance rather than command. I began to wonder if he truly felt me, or if he was choosing not to. That thought curdled into obsession. I followed rumors carried on breathless whispers. Santa had withdrawn, they said, buried himself in preparations. The new year approached, and with it the grand illusion of renewal. He would not allow disruption. He would not acknowledge me, because to do so would admit that peace had always been conditional. Cowardice, I told myself, or strategy. The uncertainty eroded me. Memories slipped. I dreamed while awake, visions of the battle long ago reshaping themselves. In some, Santa hesitated. In others, I did. In none did the ending change. I woke from these half-dreams angry with no clear target, my magic flaring unpredictably. The North grew tense. Snowstorms gathered where skies had been clear. Bells rang too often, as if trying to drown out a thought that refused to stay quiet. Fear finally bloomed, not the old, honest kind, but a nervous, uncertain version that tasted wrong. It fed me poorly. I wanted confrontation. I wanted resolution. So I went where I had avoided until then. I approached his home. Santa's hall stood radiant and defiant, carved from ancient ice and stubborn hope. Light spilled from every window, warm and inviting, daring darkness to contradict it. Wards coiled around it like sleeping serpents, alert now, finally sensing something worthy of attention. I stood before those doors and felt something unexpected ripple through me. Not triumph, not even rage. Doubt. What if I had been wrong? The thought arrived uninvited, sharp as frostbite. What if the North had not grown weak, but different? What if fear was not the only currency magic respected anymore? The crystal prison had given me too much time to argue with myself, and the arguments no longer resolved cleanly. I banished the thought with effort. Santa owed me truth at the very least, and truth is rarely gentle. I raised my hand, magic gathering like a storm, remembering its purpose. The wards shuddered, recognizing a threat older than their design. Somewhere inside, something stirred. At last. The doors did not open. They shattered outward in a burst of light and sound, and I stepped through the wreckage into warmth that felt almost obscene. The halls fell silent in my wake. Decorations trembled, candles guttered, and still Santa was not there, only echoes. My frustration tipped into something volatile. I advanced deeper, each step heavier than the last, my thoughts unraveling. I told myself this was still control, still strategy. But when I felt a presence ahead, gentler, brighter, unmistakably not him, I did not slow. I should have. The corridor opened into a room filled with soft light and familiar magic, woven with care rather than command. I knew whose magic it was before I saw her. Mrs. Claus turned toward me, surprise flickering across her face like a candle caught in wind. And in that moment, with my plans fractured and my patience spent, the future tilted, quietly, irrevocably, toward ruin. She did not scream. That detail returns to me often, sharper than any wound I received that night. Mrs. Claus looked at me not with terror, but with recognition, an awareness that reached past my horns and shadow into whatever fractured thing still resembled a soul. "Krampus," she said, as if my name were not a curse, but a memory. I hesitated. It was the smallest pause, a breath misplaced, yet entire worlds can end in such spaces. Her magic brushed against mine instinctively, not as a weapon, but as a shield shaped from compassion. It was old magic, too, older than Santa's pageantry, quiet, domestic, resilient. "You should not be here," she said gently, as if I had ever been anywhere else. I told myself I moved because she reached for something behind her. I told myself it was defense, that I could not afford mercy. These explanations assemble themselves conveniently after the fact. In truth, I do not fully remember the motion, only the sound of magic tearing where it had never been meant to tear. Light fractured. Her magic collapsed inward, not violently, but with a sound like winter settling into a lake. She fell without drama, without accusation. The warmth in the room dimmed, then faded, leaving a cold that even I recognized as wrong. I stood there, stunned by the finality of it. This was not how it was supposed to feel. Her presence lingered for a heartbeat longer, like a hand withdrawn too slowly. I sensed no fear in that last moment, only sorrow, and something that felt dangerously like forgiveness. It scraped against me, raw and unwanted. Then the world answered. Santa arrived not with bells or thunder, but with silence so absolute it crushed sound into meaninglessness. The air thickened, charged with something ancient and coiled too long. He stood at the threshold, taking in the scene in a single glance, the shattered hall, the extinguished light, the shape on the floor that refused to rise. For a moment, he did not move. For a moment, neither did I. When his gaze found me, the north changed. I had known Santa as power tempered by restraint, magic bound by ritual and repetition. What stood before me now was something else, something unmoored. Grief tore through him like a second awakening, ripping away layers of kindness that had grown comfortable over time. "You," he said. It was not an accusation, it was a fact. The magic between us surged, clashing without spell or structure. We met in the center of the hall, force against force, history against regret. He struck first, or perhaps I did. The sequence blurs. What I remember is the weight of him, the terrible clarity of his purpose. I fought with everything I had hoarded in captivity. Decades of bitterness burned bright, fueled by the certainty that this, finally, was deserved. The hall cracked, ice screamed, decorations disintegrated into meaningless fragments. I caught him off balance with a surge born of desperation rather than skill. He fell hard, consciousness slipping from him like breath into cold air. For a heartbeat, victory hovered close enough to taste. Then I felt it. The room pulsed, not with Santa's magic, but with something deeper, older, and infinitely less forgiving. Mrs. Claus lay still, her warmth gone, her magic unraveling into the fabric of the world itself. Santa stirred. When he rose, he was no longer the guardian I remembered. The power that answered his grief was not festive, not benevolent. It was winter without end. His eyes burned with a light that did not illuminate, it judged. The air around him crystallized, each breath a verdict. He reached for her, hands trembling, and poured everything into the attempt to undo what had been done. Nothing answered. I watched realization carve itself into him, slow and merciless. The power remained, but the tenderness that once guided it was gone. In its absence, something feral took shape. "This is what you wanted," he said, his voice echoing with more than one resonance. "Fear." I felt it then, true and unfiltered. Not fear of death, fear of having miscalculated everything. The north itself seemed to bow under the pressure of his awakening. Storms gathered outside in impossible spirals. Time stuttered. Magic that had slept since before names began to stir, answering Santa not as a master, but as a vessel. I had succeeded, and in doing so, I had doomed us both. I retreated, not in cowardice, but in dawning comprehension. Revenge had never been the end. It was the key that unlocked something far worse. Santa followed, relentless, no longer protecting the North, but avenging it. The final battle began without ceremony, spilling out into the frozen expanse beyond the hall. Ice and darkness collided beneath a sky tearing itself apart. Every strike echoed with consequence. Every spell rewrote something that could not be restored. I fought knowing how this would end. Not because I foresaw defeat, but because I finally understood my role. I was not the balance anymore. I was the reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. And reminders, I realized too late, are rarely allowed to survive. As the storm swallowed us both, and Santa's power surged towards something irreversible, I felt the North hold its breath, waiting to see which myth would be allowed to remain. The storm did not rage. It judged. Snow froze in midair, suspended like a constellation of unspoken verdicts. The ground beneath us cracked in slow, deliberate lines, each fracture echoing with the weight of centuries. Magic no longer obeyed intention, it answered grief, and grief is a merciless master. Santa stood at the center of it all, transformed, not corrupted, not cruel, but stripped of all softness. The ancient power inside him had awakened fully now, no longer restrained by ritual or joy. This was the force that once carved the North from nothingness, that demanded sacrifice to allow time to turn. He had become its mouthpiece. I felt small for the first time. Not weak, never that, but finite. We clashed again, and this time there was no illusion of balance. His magic did not strike me, it erased the space where I stood, forcing me to exist harder just to remain. I answered with everything I had left, drawing on bitterness so old it tasted like dust. Shadows wrapped around me, sharp and desperate, but they frayed against his presence like lies exposed to daylight. Each exchange tore memories from me. I saw the North as it once was, wild, honest, afraid. I saw myself standing tall beside the turning year, not as a monster, but as a threshold. I saw Santa younger, uncertain, his power guided by her voice, her steady hands shaping warmth from chaos. Mrs. Claus. Her absence screamed louder than any spell. I realized then the final cruelty of my victory. I had not destroyed my enemy, I had freed him from mercy. The power surging through Santa was incomplete, unbalanced without her. He wielded eternity with no one left to remind him why it mattered. I laughed. The sound surprised us both. It cracked and echoed through the storm, brittle and raw. There was no joy in it, only recognition. "So this is what remains," I said, "a God with no witness." He did not answer with words. The final blow was not spectacular. It did not arrive with light or noise. It was quiet, precise, inevitable. Magic wrapped around me, not violently, but with the certainty of an ending long delayed. I felt my form unravel, not into pain, but into release. As I fell, I saw Santa kneel beside her once more, pouring power into stillness, refusing to accept the shape of the world as it now was. The ancient force responded, bending reality until the air screamed, but death remained unmoved. Some things cannot be commanded. My body dissolved into frost and shadow, scattered across the North like a confession the wind could not keep. As sensation faded, something unexpected settled over me. Peace. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Understanding. I had been wronged, yes, but I had also been wrong. The crystal had not imprisoned a balance, it had preserved a wound, and wounds, when kept too long, rot. The storm slowly released its hold, snow resumed its fall, time remembered how to move forward. The North survived, though something vital had been altered beyond repair. Santa rose at last, diminished despite his power. The ancient force receded, unwilling to remain where love no longer tempered it. He stood alone in the aftermath, a guardian without a counterpart, a legend cracked at its center. I watched from everywhere and nowhere as the new year approached. There were no cheers at midnight, only quiet resolve. Bells rang once, low, solemn, honest. Fear returned to the world, not as a tyrant, but as a reminder. Joy followed, cautious and earned. If there is a lesson in my ending, it is not justice, it is consequence. The year turned, and somewhere in the cold spaces between moments, my name was remembered, not as a threat, not as a villain, but as a shadow that once asked too much of the light and paid the price for it. That is how my story ends, not with redemption, but with truth. Death, I learned, is not silence, it is distance. I did not vanish, as stories promise. I thinned. I became a long breath exhaled by the north itself, stretched across drifting snow and unguarded hours. I existed in the pauses, between bell and echo, between the last second of one year and the first fragile step of the next. From there, I watched. Santa remained. That truth surprised me more than my own ending. He did not retreat into legend or seal himself away in denial. He ruled, yes, but differently now. The North no longer hummed with effortless joy. It worked for its warmth. Elves no longer sang without remembering who had stopped singing. They spoke her name aloud. Mrs. Claus did not return. No miracle softened that absence. Her magic lingered only in habits, extra candles lit without instruction, doors held open a moment longer than necessary, kindness offered with restraint rather than certainty. Love, once abundant, had become deliberate. Santa aged after that, not in body, but in presence. Power sat heavier on him. He listened more, he smiled less, and when fear crept back into the world, as it inevitably does, he did not erase it. He allowed it to exist, contained but acknowledged. That was my doing, not the death, the lesson. New years passed. Some were gentle, some were harsh. The world learned again that renewal requires memory, and memory carries weight. Children dreamed less comfortably, but more honestly. Adults hesitated before celebration, aware that endings matter as much as beginnings. Sometimes, when the cold deepened just enough, I felt myself stir, not as a form, not as a will, but as a presence remembered, a shadow at the edge of ritual, a warning stitched quietly into tradition. They tell my story differently now, not as a monster defeated, nor as a hero misunderstood, but as a necessary mistake. A force that existed too long, was silenced too late, and returned when no one remembered how to listen. That is my legacy. If you feel unease when the year turns, if the bells sound heavier than expected, if joy arrives tempered with caution, know this: I am not coming back, but I am not gone. I am the reason the light no longer pretends it was never earned, and that, at last, is enough.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year! Ho, ho, ho!
If you liked the story, subscribe and like it, and also write a comment about what topic you would like to hear about.